All right. We have three people here already. We'll wait for a couple more people to come in. Oh, there we go. Excellent. Hello, everyone. Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, welcome. Um, if you want to type in the chat where you're tuning in from, we always like to know. Um, I am here at the Mark Twain House. This is not a real library,
Oh,
but I
I did
am
not know
very
that.
I was very impressed by it.
Yes,
thank
so was
you.
I.
But I am very close to the real Mark Twain Library. It's only maybe 20 feet away. Looks like we have people in California and Connecticut, of course. And Gareth is in Northern Ireland. And Lucinda, are you in England?
Yes, that's right.
Wonderful. Okay, Massachusetts, we have some people. Wonderful. So we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, if this is your first time here, I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. Thank you for joining us for this virtual program for Victorian Christmas, traditional recipes, decorations, activities, and carols. Now, virtual programs like this are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord, and we are grateful to honor his memory with these programs. And I just also want to say thank you to our members. I know there are a few of you here in the virtual audience. I can't see your faces, but I recognize your names. If you're not a member, please consider supporting our museum by becoming a member. There's so many great benefits to becoming a member. For example, you receive free or discounted admission to our author programs, the house and museum. You're on discounts in the store and cafe, and many more discounts. Please visit our website for more information or reach out to me, and I'll get you in touch with our development office. Now on to our guests. Our author, Dickens Hawksley, is a thrice great granddaughter of Charles Dickens. She has written more than 20 books, including Dickens in Travel and A Victorian Treasury. She contributes regularly to the BBC and is a patron of the Charles Dickens Museum. Our moderator, Gareth Russell, is a historian, novelist, and playwright. He is the author of several books, including The Palace, The Ship of Dreams, Young and Damned and Fair, The Emperors, and Do Let's Have Another Drink. He was educated at Oxford University and Queen's University, Belfast. During this event, we encourage you to have a conversation with each other in the chat. But if you have a specific question, please post that directly into our Q&A section. It's at the bottom of the screen. There's a small talk emoji with a question mark, and you can just click on that and put your question there. We'll be answering questions in about 40 minutes or so. So that is all from me for now. I'll be back later. Please sit back and enjoy. I'll turn this over to Lucinda and Gareth.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Omar. Well, listen, I have the book here before I get into this serious stuff. I just wanted to say it is beautiful. It is a
Thank
really,
you.
really gorgeous book. And I actually, a bone to pick is I read it in preparation for this slightly too early. So I felt like I've been ready for Christmas since about 10th of November. It is really a really fun book, but also very, very interesting. And I think people, well, I certainly did, I found that the road to the Victorian Christmas and then how it changed so fascinating. And when
Yes.
we turn to the ghosts of Christmas past, there
Yes.
were some gems in this book. So we know Christians were celebrating Christ's nativity from the early second century and likely earlier than that. I particularly enjoyed the story you told of St. Nicholas and how we allegedly got the tradition of Christmas stockings. Can you tell
Yes.
us a bit about that?
Yes. Well, St. Nicholas is actually a very ancient saint, and it was actually very much a kind of idea of helping the poor, which is what really was intended to be the real message of Christmas. And St. Nicholas heard about some girls, some daughters, who were going to be basically sold by their father into prostitution because they couldn't afford to live. Family was starving, and he didn't want this to happen. And so he gave these three young women more bags of gold coins. And then later this grew in the telling, so that St. Nicholas had climbed the chimney and thrown the coins down the chimney pot so that they were hanging up, and the stockings that the girls had hung up to dry after washing them were hanging by the fire, and the coins fell into the stockings. And that's where we get the idea of Christmas stockings from. But he is a very ancient saint, believed to have lived in kind of circa 260 to 340 something CE, and so a very, very early Christian saint. And what I particularly liked is when I was younger, I lived in Austria for a year, and St. Nicholas's Day, the 6th of December. And I know in some faiths it's really celebrated. It's celebrated in many parts of Central Europe. St. Nicholas had a really important day to himself. So he then morphs into Santa Claus, Father Christmas. They all become one kind of enormous Christmas figure, but he really has his Saint's Day on the 6th of December, and he's still celebrated in many parts of the world as himself.
Christmas has, I mean, it's interesting you talk about this kind of these many varying traditions, and Christmas itself has a checkered history. It goes through periods of peaks and troughs in and out of fashion. The emperors of Byzantium loved it as an auspicious day for a coronation. The Tudors keep it as the first of 12 days of
Yes.
consecutive celebration. But it's also condemned by, I think, probably some of my ancestors, Presbyterian century Scotland.
Yes, probably ancestors of many people here today. Those Puritans who we found really boring eventually and kicked them out.
I know, you have to imagine that. Yes, they found Jacobean London too relaxed for them, and they set sail. And yes, as you say, 17th century Puritans in England also not fans of it. But really, I was you cover it so brilliant in the book, and it sort of changes in the Victorian period. But before we get there, I thought I'd look at it on the cusp of that change. So
Yeah.
ironically, I know this isn't particularly historically precise, but I think our last Georgian monarch wasn't George, it was William the Fourth.
That's
Uh,
right, yes. And yet he still gets called Georgian. I even asked someone at the royal household once, what do you call if you're in the reign of William, which at some point, in my life, hopefully if I live
yes,
long enough, I will be. And I said, are they Williamite? They said, well, we just tend to say Georgian.
I know.
So poor old William doesn't even that William the Fourth, but yes, he was George the Third's son, the brother of George the Fourth. But he's really counted as the Georgian period.
I mean, yes. He looks like a Hanoverian with that fantastic
Yes.
pineapple head.
Yeah.
What was the status of Christmas, Lucinda, as a public and private holiday by the time William the Fourth becomes king in 1830?
Well, when you research Christmas in the kind of early 1800s, so the 1810s, 1820s, 1830s, in British newspapers, there's a lot of people writing that Christmas had lost its meaning, that it had become too commercial, which makes people laugh today. But initially, in the past, Christmas had been much more about caring for the poor, giving alms, as in ALMS, giving money and clothing and firewood and gifts to the poor, and particularly food, people who might need it. And it was felt by the end of the Georgian era that Christmas had lost its meaning and it had lost its charitable status. So when Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837, which is the year that Charles Dickens published Oliver Twist, Charles Dickens was kind of working at a time when Christmas had been seen to have become very selfish. It was all about the royal family giving each other grand gifts, the duchesses who had the most important parties, which ones were getting into the newspapers as having had the best guest list, or the most elaborate menu, or the most beautiful fashion. And people felt that Christmas had really lost its way. So by the end of the Georgian era, it was not a holiday. It wasn't a holiday in Britain for quite some time, not actually till the end of Dickens's life. So most people worked. And I think that's what many people forget, that Christmas wasn't a time off for the vast majority of people. And so it really needed a kind of renaissance, which is where my great grandfather managed to come in so incredibly well, partly by coincidence and partly by reading the zeitgeist.
Well, just to let the listeners know, Lucinda actually hadn't seen the questions beforehand, but she's teed my next one up perfectly.
Oh, good. It's always
So
nerve-wracking when you don't see the questions beforehand
I
in case
no,
you
no,
answer in the wrong
it's
order.
no. This has been a perfect touch. Thank you very much. So King William IV dies in his 70s at Windsor Castle on June the
Yeah.
20th, 1837, bringing his niece, Princess Alexandrina Victoria of Kent to the throne. I
Mm.
think she makes a quite sensible decision for all of us to go as Queen Victoria, which really makes, just as you say, December 25th, 1837, the first Victorian Christmas. And
Yeah,
during Victoria's 64 years as Queen, I think two families will revolutionize Christmas. One is your family, and the other is the royal family. So, to begin with
mhm,
the royals, in what way? Because I know you've written about Queen Victoria's
mhm.
daughter
Yes,
beforehand as well.
yes.
What ways did Queen Victoria and her German husband, Prince Albert, change the way the British observe Christmas?
It's really fascinating because within the royal household in Britain, as people are probably aware, I mean, since the Hanoverians came to the throne with George I, the royal family in Britain was actually German. So they had the Germanic traditions, many of which we all celebrate in the UK and the US as our quintessential own traditions. Many of them actually come from Germany. So if there's anybody German watching today, thank you so much for your Christmases because we do appreciate them. And so these had come into the royal family quite some years earlier. And the biggest change really came with the young Queen Charlotte, who married King George III. And anyone who's watched Bridgerton will now be very familiar with Queen Charlotte, who's one of my favourite figures from history, actually. She's a fascinating woman in many ways. And founded the first maternity hospital in London, for example, which is, something she should be very much remembered for. And she was only 17 when she left her native Germany, moved to this country where nobody was going to speak her language. And she brought with her a tradition of what they did in Mecklenburg-Strelitz, where she came from in Germany, was they would take boughs, not the whole tree, but a yew tree, boughs of the yew tree, kind of the branches, and that greenery would be placed on a table, and it would be lit up with candles. Very dangerous. Please don't try this at home. And all sorts of little decorations that people would usually make, little pretty kind of jewels or things that they'd made. And underneath the branch would be placed, underneath the greenery, would be placed presents, which children would place for their parents. And then the parents would come in and find them. And it was a very sweet thing they did on Christmas Eve. So Queen Charlotte brought this with her, and then in 1800, she decided to do something special for the children of the royal household in Britain. And so all the kind of children of those people who worked for her, they were invited to a party, and she had had a whole yew tree put into a pot, which she had decorated in the German style, and and a lot of it was kind of dried fruits and things. And these were on the tree for the children to come in, and the children were given sweets and one toy each to take home. But this was very much just within the royal household, and so the British aristocracy felt they had this little secret. But what Prince Albert would do when he married Queen Victoria in 1840, and a few years later, he decided, well, why is this just being kept within our family? This is something that the whole nation should know about. Prince Albert was a fascinating man. Thank you for mentioning my other book. I wrote a biography of his and Victoria's daughter, Princess Louise. She was a sculptor. She was a fascinating woman. And one of the things that I really learned writing that book was what a remarkable man Prince Albert was. I don't think he's given enough credit today for the extraordinary things he did. He was very interested in education. He educated his own children very interestingly, and he wanted to educate the British people. So many of the museums in London, we give thanks to Prince Albert for those, and the fact that they're free to get into, all of those things. So part of this was to share their Christmas tradition. And he had at Windsor Castle, he had a tree put up in the courtyard that was decorated, and then people could see it going past. The royal family were very good at sending out press releases as well. And so the press were told about this, and an illustration of this tree, of course, this is pre most kind of photography, an illustration of this tree with the royal family was placed in the Illustrated London News, which was a very widely read paper that was sent to all parts of the world as well. And so through this, the idea of the Christmas tree became instantly popular. And Prince Albert also sent Christmas trees with decorations and servants to decorate them to show how to the local barracks, the local school, which just happened to be Eton, which is probably famous today for Princes William and Harry going to it. But this started to get it into kind of everybody's homes. And there's some rather wonderful records of early Christmas trees, which didn't have to be trees. So people would make trees out of paper or out of bits of material. There's a wonderful notebook in the Museum of London of a young woman, a lower middle class woman in the East End of London, buying calico to make a Christmas tree for her neighbours' children. So it really became something that didn't have to be the traditional tree brought into the house, but something that you could have to symbolise a Christmas tree. And it's become one of our best loved traditions.
Well, I love this. To move on to your family, I love this next quote from. So just before I move on, I'll segue off. I think it's quite interesting that the royal family still open all their gifts on Christmas Eve. They still
Yes,
do the ceremony
yeah,
tradition. Yeah.
yeah.
When I previously read a book on the Queen Mother, and apparently when she married into it, she was aghast that it was Christmas Eve and
Yes.
not Christmas Day. But they still keep that tradition that they open at Christmas Eve. Well, I love this next quote from your three times great grandfather in 1836, the year before Victoria becomes Queen.
Hmm.
Charles Dickens wrote, "Who can be insensible to the outpourings of good feeling and the honest interchange of affectionate attachment which abound at this season of the year? A Christmas family party we know nothing in nature more delightful. There seems a magic in the very name of Christmas." And 7 years later, in 1843, Dickens published his A Christmas Carol,
Hmm.
in which literature's soon to be most famous curmudgeon Ebenezer Scrooge learns to shed his miserly ways and love Christmas. What impact did A Christmas Carol have on Victorian Christmases?
It's absolutely astounding, actually, how much it affected not just Victorian Christmases, but Christmas ever since. So yes, it was published in 1843, and this was actually the year after Charles Dickens went to America for the first time. So he travelled through America and Canada. He went twice to America, but the first time was 1842. And one of the crucial things that happened there was that he changed his religion. He became great friends with Longfellow, the poet. They stayed friends for the rest of their lives. And Longfellow was a Unitarian. Now, Charles Dickens had been brought up Protestant, and he was a strong Christian, but he was frustrated by the hypocrisy that he saw it of Christianity. And he felt that Unitarianism was going to do something about poverty. And so he embraced this new sector of Christianity very strongly. And when he came back to England, life became quite difficult. His next two books, his first travelogue about America, American Notes, was not so well received as his novels. People didn't really know what to make of it. And Martin Chuzzlewit, his next novel, was also not as universally loved. And then he was finding life quite tough. And then he was sent a government report that had been written by a wonderful campaigner, a man called Dr. Thomas Southwood Smith. And he wanted to recruit Dickens to kind of his cause of campaigning. So he'd been commissioned to write this report for the government into labour laws and particularly where it related to children. So child poverty and child labour. And Charles Dickens said that he wept when he read this. Now, most people at the time would not have known that Charles Dickens himself was a child labourer. When his father was arrested and sent to prison for debt, Charles Dickens worked in a factory. And this was a time in his life that stayed, although it was less than a year, had a huge impact on him. And he never, ever forgot what it was like to be a poor child, to worry about being able to eat, having to visit his family in prison, and the fear of the constant fear that hung over them of the debtor's prison and or the workhouse. So when he read this report, he had been asked if he would write something, perhaps another kind of thing for the government, which he'd planned on doing, a non-fiction pamphlet. And then he thought, presumably, I'm putting these words into his head, but he seems to have thought, well, why would I do this? Who's going to read it? When what I can actually do much better is to make it a story. Now, he told his publishers that he had an idea for a book about Christmas, and they thought it was a very odd idea. They thought it was very uncommercial and that nobody would want to read it. So they said, well, if you're insistent on this crazy idea, we need you to pay for a large amount of the cost. So he self-published A Christmas Carol. He had to pay for a lot of the production costs, particularly because he wanted quite expensive, very beautiful illustrations, hand-tinted, 4 of them. But he went to Manchester while he was thinking about what he would be writing next, while he was thinking about this report. And in Manchester, in the north of England, he encountered even more poverty. He went there for work, to work for a charity. He visited his sister who lived there, and she had 2 sons, one of whom was quite disabled. And his name was Harry Burnett. And he is he's really the inspiration for Tiny Tim, Bob Cratchit's son. So Charles Dickens came back from Manchester and he wrote to a friend on the way home that he was going to write a hammer blow in favour of the poor man's child. That hammer blow was A Christmas Carol. He wrote it astonishingly in just 6 weeks. And today is actually the anniversary. It came out on the 19th of December, 1843. So it's never been out of print in all of those years. It's a quite extraordinary book. And one of the things that it did was to create not only a change, a kind of renaissance in the way that people celebrated Christmas, the fact that people started to focus more on charity, thinking about those like the Cratchit family, for example, and crucially, like the two children, Ignorance and Want, who appear with the Ghost of Christmas Present, they became all important, and they are the crux of Dickens's story. They're vital to the story. So if you're ever adapting A Christmas Carol, please do not leave out Ignorance and Want, or Dickens may come and haunt you, because they are the heart of his story. They and Tiny Tim. Um, and so it really started to make people change. It made employers think about how they treated their employees. You know, we have Scrooge and Bob Cratchit's relationship to thank for that. It also made publishers and other writers and illustrators go, we need to do a Christmas book. This is all important. We have to do a book about Christmas. So by 1844 Christmas, by which point Dickens was on his second Christmas book, there were so many Christmas stories out there. There'd been a race all year to get the next big Christmas seller. And that desire for a Christmas literary market has never gone. It's quite phenomenal. People want Christmas stories every single year. We see it as well in the film industry and the TV industry. There's a huge appetite for it.
Well, it's a little, I mean, you mentioned America. It's this cultural juggernaut is taking off in Britain after Dickens' novel. But it's
Yeah.
a little later that Christmas really takes off as a popular holiday in America, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, well, because the Puritans who'd left England in high dudgeon after we restored the monarchy in 1660. So King Charles I had his head chopped off, and the Puritans had taken hold, and everybody thought at first, yeah, get rid of the monarchy, get rid of the monarchy. And then they seemed to think, you know what, these Puritans are pretty boring. And most of all, they've banned Christmas. So we can go to church on Christmas Day, and we have to go to church on Christmas Day, but we're not allowed to do anything fun. There's no singing of carols. There's not even any Christmas foods. In fact, there were soldiers stationed to check whether people were carrying seasonal foods, which were illegal. Mince pies were extremely blasphemous because initially they'd been like baby Jesus's cradle. So on the top, instead of a pastry top, there'd be a little pastry baby Jesus lying in his crib. So these were very blasphemous and they were banned. And then they thought, we want the fun things back. So of course, when the Puritans went off to America, suddenly it just happened that Christmas had to be banned there too. So I think it was in the 1650s that the governor of Massachusetts banned Christmas. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it wasn't until the 19th century that Christmas began to be really widely celebrated in the US. And it wasn't until 1870, which was the year that Charles Dickens died, that Christmas was declared a national holiday. It was actually the same in Britain that it became officially a bank holiday, what we call a public holiday here, as in when the banks are closed, a bank holiday. And that was the same year. So Dickens's life had kind of led up to this moment that in the year of his death, Christmas suddenly starts to become a big holiday in the UK and the US. But in Scotland, I say in the UK, but in Scotland, because Scotland was far more puritanical in its religious beliefs, Christmas was not celebrated. I mean, people today will tell me, I did a Christmas tour last week, and a man who's probably in his 70s said, oh yeah, we always worked on Christmas Day. He said it was only very recently that Christmas Day became a holiday in Scotland. That's why Hogmanay, or New Year, is much, much bigger in Scotland than Christmas is still today, because it was seen as very frivolous to celebrate Christmas in the way it was celebrated in England.
Yeah, there's some parts of far north east Northern
Mhm.
Ireland where it was the same. I mean, 2 generations ago, but kind of
Yes.
those like strong non-conformist and Presbyterian communities. They just didn't. It
Yeah.
wasn't something they did. And apparently, though, they were also monarchists. That when the royals started doing Christmas Day broadcasts, they realized they'd have to stop working. So, so we maybe another
Well, that would have
aircraft.
been the 1930s, wasn't it, with the
Yeah, it's George the
BBC? So,
Fifth. Yeah, it
yeah.
was. So
Mm.
it's an odd thing from a historian's perspective to think of George the Fifth starting a party,
Yeah.
rather, rather than intentionally killing it. That seems to have been what happened. And then I have a few more questions to ask Lucinda. We're having a wonderful time. But if there's a question that you want to ask and I haven't asked, please use the technical wizardry to type a question into the lovely Omar, and he'll ask it when we're towards the end of the interview. So, pivoting from the history a little bit, Victorian Christmas has some fabulous recipes.
Yes.
I 3 years ago, Lucinda tried an impossible act of hubris. I don't know if you ever got cakes from Conditor and Cook in London, but I decided I was going to bake one myself,
They
and
are
it
such good cakes, and I'm very impressed that you tried that.
Lucinda, again, hold your praise. It was such a catastrophic culinary disaster that even my mother couldn't pretend it was nice. Everything. It looked like
What
Windsor
did you
Castle,
attempt to cook? I need to know which it
the
was.
curly whirly cake,
Okay, right.
which is the best cake in the world, I think. And I ended up serving something that looked like Windsor Castle after the fire. Uh, it was just awful. But people could follow these recipes in Victorian Christmas. Have
Yes.
you any personal favorites of the recipes in the book?
Well, I'm vegetarian, so I have to say that the ones that were put in, what I did, I found the Victorian recipes, and
Yes.
then they said, could I write the modern recipes? And I know if there's any cookery writers out there, you'll know this is a very distinct art. You really have to be a proper cookery writer. And I said, I'm absolutely not, and nobody wants me to tell them how to cook a turkey. So I love the fact that the first Christmas cake appeared in Charles Dickens's lifetime. So
Yes.
until this time, it had been a 12th cake, which was, you mentioned the 12 days of Christmas. This was what Charles Dickens always celebrated. Very, very many years, Christmas began on Christmas Eve and then finished on the 6th of January, which in the Dickens household was a double celebration because it was the birthday of their eldest child, Charlie. And so a 12th cake was this incredible, elaborate thing, which I love looking at illustrations in the newspapers from the kind of 18th and early 19th century. They are wonderful confections with, sugar figures and filigree and all sorts of amazing things on them. So I loved having the first, the very first Christmas Christmas cake recipe in there. I also, people constantly talk about Brussels sprouts on toast, which I think I might actually try this year because actually it's quite fun to see it. And I do, I'm one of the people who likes Brussels sprouts.
Do you?
As long as they're well cooked, as long as they're not overcooked, I think, yeah,
Yes,
they have to
that's
be sauteed, not boiled.
yes. My sister, she's has been designated Brussels sprouts for some time. It's her Christmas Day fiefdom.
That's her
She,
contribution, is it?
that's,
Um,
it's
but I also
they're
love
very
one of the
obsessively managed.
one of my favorite recipes in here because it comes from my grandfather's cousin who I actually adored, Cedric. I knew him very well. And I that was smoking bishop, which is a kind of a much more alcoholic mulled wine. So
Uh-huh.
please do not serve it to any guests who are driving. But it has it. But it's wonderful. It's the recipe I've used, which I got permission from his daughter, who's a very dear friend of mine as well as a cousin. And this is the drink that Ebenezer Scrooge invites Bob Cratchit to share with him. So at the end of Christmas Carol, you may remember he says, come with me, Bob, and I'll raise your salary and I'll endeavour to help your struggling family, and we'll sort it all out over a steaming bowl of smoking bishop. And everybody always says to me, what is it whenever they read Christmas Carol? So I thought, right, this has to go in.
Yes.
And Cedric very kindly also is sadly no longer alive, but he also gave his recipe to the Charles Dickens Museum in London so that they could make it for their guests, and also they were used to sell the recipe as well. So it involves quite a lot of time because you have to have oranges, Seville oranges, Cedric always insisted on, which are roasted. So you kind of roast them in the oven. You put you kind of stud them with cloves, and then you roast them for an hour, and then after that they have to cool for 12 to 24 hours. And his wife used to say, preparing for Christmas, I've got all this food and he's got these oranges in the fridge and I can't do anything, I can't get anything else in there. So it always makes me laugh when I think about it. It's fine if you have a kind of larder or a pantry. If you live somewhere like California and it's hot weather, you are going to have to put them somewhere a bit cooler, so you will be taking over the fridge. But it's particularly lovely because then the flavour of the oranges, and they get that sweetness from being roasted. So there's a wonderful mix of flavours there. Now, in addition to the wine, he added port. I've also seen recipes that add brandy. That's what makes it so incredibly alcoholic. So people think, oh, mulled wine's not very alcoholic because all the alcohol burns off when you cook it. It's absolutely not true with smoking bishop, particularly if it was made by Cedric himself.
Yes.
So yeah, I could never drink more than a sniff of it if he'd made it. But it is a particularly lovely one because there's a lot of love that goes into it, and it's that smell, that aroma. My father used to make it, and I just have very happy memories of him doing, roasting the oranges and getting it prepared. It's that lovely smell of oranges and cloves that provides this gorgeous Christmassy smell. I also drink very little alcohol. I mean, I really don't drink very much at all. So I do spiced apple juice every year. So I decided to put that in what you'd call cider, but cider in England is always alcoholic. The first time I saw somebody a child cider in America, I was absolutely horrified. And then I found that it's alcohol free. if you come to England and you ask for cider, be aware it will be alcoholic. So I do spiced apple juice, which I think is a really delicious thing to have at parties. It's just a lovely thing to do. And you can add all the cloves and the cinnamon and just nutmeg and just make the kitchen smell gorgeous.
It must be quite a lovely experience with a book like this to try some of the recipes. Or
Yes.
I think the smell and the taste. I mean, it's not the same. It's not as lovely as yours at all. When I did my book on the Queen Mother, I thought over a Christmas party, oh, I'll make gin and Dubonnet for my guests.
Oh yes, our favorite drink.
Absolute paint stripper, Lucinda. But I said, he said, after one, you need a taxi. After two, an ambulance. After three, a priest. Um,
And is that the secret to her long life? Because I've heard that said many times that it was the secret to
yeah,
her
yeah.
longevity.
And it's funny. It's a friend who worked in the royal household in Northern Ireland said, the trick was that she really didn't take anything bubbly. It was usually because a gin and jubbonny you can sip. I was like, okay, but she would use it because it would mean that if she was doing this with the rounds, talking to people, she wouldn't feel a bit belchy or anything. But yeah,
Uh-huh.
apparently, I think a gin and jubbonny, if you can survive them, fortifies you. There's no science behind that, but I think it's part of the 101 years. Um,
The recipe that I've not ever dared make because it's I just like you would be a bit like your recipe is the chocolate Yule log, the original French Pierre Lacam, who was a very famous French chef. But that is an amazing recipe. But I would always buy one because I'm afraid life's too short. But if you are a master baker, this is a fabulous recipe to do.
I think life's too short. My new line. Anytime I'm buying something. You alluded to this earlier, actually, and there's another Christmas tradition I wanted to talk about with our guests, which is so as the Victorian period continues, Christmas becomes a staple. And so
Yes,
many works in popular fiction. I love Sherlock Holmes, so I was love to see the Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle.
excellent.
Uh, book. But it also the Christmas pantomime,
Mhm.
which becomes a tradition and continues today as a staple of British Christmases. They never quite caught on in America. It's often quite difficult to explain what they are,
Yes.
um, because objectively they're insane. What were the original pantomimes, Lucinda, and when do they really become very popular in Britain?
Okay, well, so I teach American students, and I didn't realize until I started teaching them that Americans really don't understand pantomime. They think it's a kind of mime. But no, it's not to do with any of that. It's not kind of trying to get out of a box. As you can see, I'm not very good at miming, but it's a pantomime is a totally different thing. And it comes from very, very ancient art of mumming. And mumming was the traveling players, and they predate Shakespeare. These go back a really, really, really long time. These are medieval and probably earlier. And they would go around at Easter and Christmas. They would go to people's houses. There'd be very distinct characters, like the hobby horse, and there would be all sorts of kind of tropes that they would come up with. And these kind of grew into the pantomime. Now, pantomime is much older than the Victorians, and Charles Dickens himself, as a little boy, was regularly taken to pantomimes, and he recalled them very fondly, and they were a really important part of his life. So just to give a little idea, they're based on current affairs, but they are built around fairy tales. So things like Puss in Boots, Dick Whittington and his cat, Cinderella, all sorts of kind of old-fashioned fairy tales, but they have very distinctive people in them. So, for example, the main male character is called the principal boy and is always played by a woman. And then there is an older female character called the pantomime dame who is always played by a man. So there's always a love interest. There's the kind of the princess and the the man who's been masquerading as a beggar or whatever it may be. Or there's the Dick Whittington character, but there has to be a love interest at some point because the principal boy and the main young woman have to fall in love. There's also various kind of talking animals and things. And if you go to a pantomime, if you come to England, I would urge you to. It's great fun. They happen around Christmas time, and you'll probably be horrified by the audience yelling at the stage. It's the one time in a theatre that you are to have no inhibitions. So there's various things that you have to shout. For example, there's always a villain, a very kind of typical stage villain, and they will come onto stage and they'll be kind of hiding around. And the good character at the front is often a little bit kind of naive, and they'll say, "Have you seen the wizard?" And the audience has to shout, "He's behind you!" And by which point the wizard has leapt behind a tree, and they turn around and go, "No, he's behind." So there's all these kind of things. They invite children up onto stage. It is an absolute classic part of a British Christmas, as I'm sure you know, Gareth. I'm sure did you go to them when you were little? They
I
are
did.
they
I
are
actually just
wonderful.
I started taking my little godson to them now, so
Yeah.
it's just and I'm probably enjoying them more than I did than I did when I
Well,
was a
this is the
child.
great thing about them is they are written at all the best children's books are written to appeal to the parents or guardians who are reading them. And pantomime is no exception. And sometimes the humor can be very racy, but children don't get it. There's definitely two levels. And they also lampoon, which of course Dickens loved and did a great deal in his work, the current political situation, whatever it may be. So the pantomime can change. It can change from the beginning of the run to the end. Characters can ad lib a bit. So if there's a big political thing or a big funny celebrity thing or anything that's happened, somebody's been disgraced or somebody's got married or whatever, or there's been something in the royal family that they know everybody's talking about, they'll bring that into the pantomime. It can be very subversive. It can also be very loving. And usually you have very famous stars of stage and screen who appear in pantomime, or panto as they'll call it. So, for example, Ian McKellen, Sir Ian McKellen, many years ago, he was asked, surely you must have done everything you want to in life. And he said, I've never been in EastEnders, which is a big TV soap opera here, and no, Coronation Street. So Coronation Street, he said he wanted to be in, and he wanted to be in pantomime, which are the two kind of jobbing actors' jobs that you get at the beginning of your career. But no, here he was. So now every year he carried on doing a fabulous pantomime. Dickens would have loved that. Pantomime was a huge part of getting the whole family together. It was theatre for all the family, and it still continues to be today. One of Dickens's first works was actually compiling the memoirs of the clown who was also in pantomime, Joseph Grimaldi. And Grimaldi had died, and his memoirs had been written but not yet published. And Dickens took on the job. He was asked to edit them and get them ready for publication. And because he was a huge fan of Grimaldi, Dickens wrote very proudly about how he had worked on his works, having seen him perform several times when he was a child. So that was the crucial bit of Christmas for him.
Well, there's a lot of joy and love for Christmas in this book, and
Yes.
ah, I think Christmas is such a special time, and I think anyone who's interested either in the Victorians or in this time of year will love it. It also contains notes on the origins of Victorian carols, which I
Yes.
find fascinating, including my personal favorite, which is "O Little
Which is
Town
that?
of Bethlehem."
Oh,
Um,
okay. Yes.
yeah, I know it's not a usual one, but I love it. I don't know what it is, and I didn't know it was written
It's a
by the American,
beautiful one. A
isn't
Little Town
it?
of Bethlehem. Yeah. Do you think it's because we read it, sorry, we sang it at school when we were children?
Yes,
So I think that's
yes.
probably why so many people like it.
We had we were so lucky with our school, Lucinda. It's outside Belfast, but it's next to the cathedral where St. Patrick is buried. So we got to do our Christmas carols there.
Wow.
Here, so it was very, very special. And again, though, youth is wasted on the young. You don't fully appreciate, but I remember a little town of Bethlehem and absolutely loving it. And there's a lovely, I mean, with all of them, there's the lyrics and the notes, and that it was written by the American clergyman Phillips Brooks in 1868. Do you have any caroling favorites, and are they Victorian?
Um, well, actually, most carols tend to be earlier, but they were often changed in the Victorian times. I love Silent Night. I think it's really,
Uh,
really beautiful, just because it's got such resonance. But I think Away in a Manger, which again is something you read as you listen, you hear all the time, and as a child, that's the one that you always know. But I just love Christmas carols in general. I mean, I went last night. Normally I read at it, but I was doing another event earlier, so I got there in time to hear my sister reading. There's the most beautiful Dickensian carol concert held in London at the oldest church in London. It dates from the 1100s. It's the oldest parish church in London, I should say. And it's St. Bartholomew the Great. And I was standing, because I had to get there so late, right at the back, and there were no seats left. It holds, I don't know how many thousands of people. It's enormous. And I was looking up at the ancient stones and hearing people sing Hark the Herald Angels Sing. And it felt so incredible to think people have been singing in this church for nearly 1,000 years. And it was such a moving moment. And I think any kind of Christmas carols that take us back to that beautiful time that we, remember, if we're lucky enough to have had kind of happy childhoods where you sang carols, it's a really important one. I love the older carols as well, things like the Holly and the Ivy, which has such an
yeah.
old history to it, but it's just there all the time. In Christmas films, kind of sampled in Christmas music. So yeah, I'm not a great singer. Nobody wants to hear me sing professionally, but I love to be in a group where no one can actually hear my voice singing lustily.
Do you know, I cannot carry a tune in a bucket, listen. I'm one of the worst singers you could imagine. But I really, Christmas is when I can let go and just
Exactly.
tunelessly sing because there are so
Yeah,
many people around me. And if it's a stone
exactly.
church like St. Bartholomew's, that will absorb the sound all the better. Uh,
Exactly.
so another thing, and then I'll open it up to some questions. But when you lived in Guatemala, you mentioned you discovered their custom because this is a big debate.
Yes.
When do you say Wirzen to Christmas? When do you take the decorations down? And when you lived in Guatemala, you discovered that it's a custom there to keep the Christmas decorations up until the Christian feast of Candlemas, which is
Yeah.
this February 2nd.
Yes.
Are there any other Christmas traditions from around the world you love, and when do you take your decorations down?
Well, it's difficult. We take the interior decorations down on the 6th of January, sadly, but leave the external lights up until the 2nd of December. I would like to try and leave them up for longer, but people get really kind of, oh, you're going to get bad luck if you leave the lights up after the 6th of
Yeah,
January. But I do like to have some lights up still because, living where I do, in London, it's the kind of most miserable time of year for me is the 6th of January when all the sparkling lights come down and London looks so absolutely beautiful at the moment with the Christmas windows and the lights. And then suddenly you're in this really grey, dark city thinking we've got another at least 3 months of this. So for me, it's really important to have those lights. I also love Diwali, by the way, any kind of festival of lights. I just think anything that brings light in midwinter. I love the greenery. I mean, Christmas trees to me are really important. I decorate my tree with such kind of fervor because all my Christmas decorations come either from places around the world that I've traveled or from people who've given them to me. So every year, either putting up the decorations or taking them down, it's quite a ritual for me, remembering the people who've given them to me or the places that I bought them. And I really think that we should keep Christmas going until Twelfth Night. I feel very, very strongly about this, that it is 12 days of Christmas. Here in the UK, we have Boxing Day, which I don't think people celebrate in America, but St. Stephen's Day, the 26th of December. So Christmas here doesn't end until the 27th, at least. But I think for me, it goes on till the 6th of January. I mean, I just think it's wonderful doing as many Christmassy things, going to the theatre or catching up with friends and trying to keep that Christmas spirit going right the way through to Twelfth Night.
I completely, 6th January is my cutoff point as well for several reasons. One is my mother left to her own devices, would leave her Christmas lights up until Easter. She loves them. Uh,
Woman after my own heart.
So I like to work with her. It's like I'll give you the 6th of January one, but people will talk. But also I think it's quite miserable, isn't it, when people I was going to say Scrooge like, but it's a bit when people are like, well, come the 27th, you're done. One of the most
Yeah,
magical times of the year in Britain is the fantastic no man's land
yeah.
between Stephen's Day and New Year's Eve, when no one knows what day it is, and everyone's just eating 12,000 calories in chocolate and leftover turkey per day. Um, I do, and I also think it's such a shame when you've done this ritual and you've done all the hustle and bustle of the shopping, all the rest of it, not to have those days in your home where it kind of
Mm,
sparkles a bit. I was in, I don't know if you saw it actually, but it was in the news. There's a quite grand department store in in London, Fortnum and Masons, and it's
mhm.
when you go there at Christmas, it is like the last lifeboat off the Titanic, I think.
Yes.
Uh, but um, but even Queen Camilla was spotted in there today. So she
Ah,
ran in to grab some extra tins of biscuits, and
oh, good for
that's
her because I went in a couple of days ago and it actually was more busy than I've ever seen it in my life. And I actually walked out without buying anything because I couldn't cope with the stress, which is the first time that's ever happened to me. So I thought, oh, wow, they're doing really, really well this year. Well done, Queen Camilla, for actually battling through the 5 billion people who were in the doorway.
somebody was on the radio said you could tell Queen Camilla is the offspring of military personnel because only a soldier's daughter could barrel her way through Fortnum and Mason a week before before Christmas.
I'm a soldier's daughter and it defeated me. So she's made of sterner stuff. No, I very much admire her for that. Fortnum and Mason, if you haven't been, to anyone who's visiting, it really is worth seeing, and it is particularly beautiful at this time. It's lovely all time of year, but it is particularly beautiful at this time of year, and they have fantastic Christmas windows. So I will be taking advantage of it in the period between Christmas and New Year, most definitely. And of course, when the January sales happen, when maybe they'll sell off their Christmas things for cheaper.
I know it. Which it's nice. We have some Christmas decorations that from last January. They're just gone up.
Well, I
From the
do
from
hope, Gareth, that you are going to say to your mum that she can keep her lights up at least outside until the 2nd of February, you see. Tell her about
I will.
Candlemas.
I like said Candlemas. It comes from good Presbyterian stock, but actually I just leaned in sort of the residual high Anglican within us all. You will take Candlemas, anything to keep the lights up. Um, well, listen, I wanted to just say before I open up to questions again, I absolutely love this book. You can probably tell I am a real Christmas nut.
Thank you.
Um, and it was really, really joyful. Did you? I felt like you had a wonderful time writing it.
I did. It was a real gift, actually. I wrote a book called Dickens and Christmas some years ago, about four years ago, and I really loved that. And I got very immersed in not only Dickens's Christmas, so his five Christmas novellas. He didn't just write a Christmas Carol; he wrote five, and his Christmas stories and his own family Christmases. But doing that meant I was researching Christmas in general through Dickens's lifetime and earlier. So it was a real gift for me to get the chance to do this. And a lot of the research that I hadn't been able to use in Dickens and Christmas, it was when the publisher said to me, "Would you like to do a book on the Victorian Christmas?" I said, "Well, here's the reams of research that I have that I've not been able to use before." So this is a real joy. Like you, I absolutely love Christmas. And for me, it's a really special time of year, particularly just being able to see friends and family and everything that's associated with it. I can sit and watch Christmas films ad nauseam while I'm writing my Christmas cards. I just think it's a
Ah,
really fun thing to do. So it's just such a joyous time because winter is not my favorite time of year. I don't like the grey and the dark and the cold. Obviously, if you're in Australia or New Zealand, it's a very, very different experience. But for me, having that midwinter festival, which has been important to human beings for millennia, long pagan times, long before the birth of Christianity, long before the Romans and their Saturnalia, this idea of being aware that the summer will return and that midwinter you just get beyond the shortest day and the light will slowly start to return. I think that's something that's perhaps inherent in all of us.
that's a lovely, lovely way to put it. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to open up to questions. I'm sure there are
We have a
something.
lovely comment here from Philadelphia. Hello, Mary Ann. Thank you. Here in Philadelphia, we understand mumming. Also, O Little Town of Bethlehem is a Philly favourite, as Philip
Ah,
Brooks was rector of the Church of the Holy Trinity in Philadelphia when he wrote it. Thank you so much for sharing that, Mary Ann. That's wonderful.
not at all. That's so interesting. Thank you, Marianne.
And Kate, hello, Kate. Yes, you are quite right. It is the anniversary of the first publication of A Christmas Carol, well known. Yes, he wrote it in just 6 weeks. 6 weeks to write a masterpiece. Incredible.
Many of us actually here at the Mark Twain House went to watch A Christmas Carol at our local Hartford stage last night.
Oh, how
So
lovely.
yes, and it was quite a wonderful production.
Now, do
Very
you know that
fun.
Dickens gave his 30th birthday speech at Hartford, Connecticut?
Oh my goodness.
And he was on his first trip to America and he got into big trouble. If you look in your newspaper archives, they were very cross with him because he used his speech to make a political point about the fact there was no international copyright law and that therefore he wasn't getting any money for all his books published in America and
Yes.
American authors weren't getting any money for things published in Britain. And they were very, I think it was the Hartford Chronicle. Does that make sense? Very cross.
Uh, the Hartford Current.
Oh, could be. Yes.
Yeah,
Very cross
yeah,
with him.
yeah.
Yes. Told him
Uh-oh.
off about it.
Well, at least Mark Twain followed his lead a few decades later by
Yes.
advocating for copyright law. And it's
Yes.
it's actually the reason that he wore the white suit. He wanted to stand out amongst all the men, of course, at that time, in
Yeah.
Congress were wearing their black suits, and so he wanted to make a statement, and he just continued to wear the white suit for the rest of his life.
I love that. That's wonderful. Thank you. I didn't know that was why.
Yes, and our house here at the Mark Twain House is decorated for Christmas, of course, a Victorian Christmas,
Mhm.
a bit later than Christmas Carol. So this is more of a 1870s Christmas, but we do keep the decorations up only until the 7th, I think, of January.
Yes.
So
Yes.
unfortunately,
Most
we do
people are
not
very
keep them.
superstitious about that.
Yeah.
The Charles
But
Dickens Museum in London is also beautifully decorated at the moment, and it's such a gorgeous place to
um,
go at this time of year, because they used to start decorating. They used to decorate in early December, but it's sneaked in earlier and earlier, and now I think it was the 11th of November because people want the Dickens
yes.
Museum to be decorated as early as possible.
Well, we don't have any questions, but we can sort of keep the conversation going until
Yeah,
something comes
absolutely.
up. Um,
That's the thing, isn't it? Because I do think it's the same as Veterans Day in America, but I do think my the more enthusiastic of the Christmas devout. I think they will wait until Remembrance Day, and then that's it. All
Wow.
that's when the decorations start to go up. It's like an American friend of mine said it's a little bit similar in that some of the devotees of seasonal change will see Thanksgiving as the point after which you can really
Yes.
start gearing
Yeah,
up.
Yes.
that is the traditional time. A lot of shops have started to sell Christmas things on November 1st.
Right. Well, we've had
Uh,
that here for quite a long time. I remember taking some American students to the National Gallery at the end of September, where you could buy Christmas decorations in the gallery shop, and they were absolutely amazed. But of course, because we don't have Thanksgiving over here,
yeah.
it's yeah, it's kind of as soon as the children go back to school in September, isn't it, Gareth? People just
Yes,
start selling Christmas things.
I don't, maybe I'm going to sound slightly curmudgeonly here. I think it's too early. I quite
Mm,
like my Christmas
I
in.
agree.
Mhm.
I want to feel my seasons change. I don't want them all
Yes.
piled on top of each other like my
Hmm.
Yes.
terrible
Yes.
cake.
Yeah.
We it looks like we have a comment from Heidi who says, "Just wanted to say I bought the book and love it."
Well, thank you,
Um,
Heidi.
and Beth has a very important question for
Yes.
the for our for Americans.
Yes.
Can you tell us what Boxing Day is
Oh,
about?
yeah, very good question. Thank you very much for that, Beth. So, Boxing Day, the name comes, people often think it's about the sport, and partly because it's traditionally now become a day about sports, particularly things like horse racing and football and things. But actually, it came from the tradition of giving a Christmas box, which was basically a Christmas present, a box filled with money or clothing or food or whatever it was to your employees. So, traditionally here, Boxing Day, the day after Christmas, the 26th, is when people have leftovers for their big lunch. You know, you've all eaten so much on Christmas Day. But the reason behind that is because, of course, it was the servants' day off. Because the servants had to work exceptionally hard on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day to give the families, if they were domestic servants, they had to work hard to give the families they worked for the best Christmas ever. So they were cooking and cleaning and clearing away. And so Boxing Day, the 26th of December, was the servants' day off, and the food would be left out, all the leftovers from the day before, cold cuts, salads, whatever it might be. And that has become the traditional Boxing Day turkey sandwich or whatever people might have now. But it all dates back to the fact that this was the Christmas box. The Christmas box was also what was given to the poor from churches. So the alms box that people would put money into, people could go to the church and they would be given money as well. So yeah, that's where the word box comes from.
Do you have
Uh,
any Boxing Day traditions, Lucinda?
Um, Really, it's just recovery. I love playing games. This kind of games when I was a child. We used to do things like charades, and we'd put on plays for my grandmother, and she used to come. But for
Uh,
me, it's actually a really important day to try and get together with family. And I really love playing games. Not everybody else does, but that's a thing that I like to do. When I was a child, we would go do a lot of kind of walking, and because we have dogs. There's
oh
always
yeah.
a big Boxing Day walk. So that's probably my favorite thing actually, is the Boxing Day walk when you see everybody walking around in their Christmas present, all the teenagers trailing along with their new, headphones or whatever, and just preferably going somewhere really nice to try and walk off the one of the 12,000 chocolates that you've eaten the day before.
Yes, we've a retriever who they're such a greedy breed, but
Yes.
such a constantly happy one. They need long Boxing Day walks. So do we all. We're actually on the subject of games, Lucinda. We are currently 4 years, excuse me, into a 5 year ban on Monopoly, in the
Now I
family.
can understand that ban
It
totally.
it was the Golden Girls, the American sitcom, a Golden Girls themed Monopoly that ended with
Love it.
what I can only describe as acts of egregious violence. Everything, the worst thing to happen to Christmas since Herod was how it was described. Uh, so we are just over the midpoint. But we can still crack out a good Downton Abbey themed Cluedo.
Yes, well,
Um,
you see, Cluedo's got to be one of the best. It's got to be one of the ones up there. I think in
Clue,
America it's
sorry.
called Clue. Yeah,
Yeah. Love a Cluedo. Clue.
Yeah.
yes. But we
Kelly,
have a Labrador, so she will need a huge amount of
Uh,
exercise, and then the Jack
no,
Russell will just tag along.
they're good dogs, but they could eat until they exploded and feel
Mm,
no, so could I.
yes.
But
Kelly asks, would Dickens have known about Krampus?
Oh, that's really interesting. Now, I don't know, Kelly, because to me, and you can correct me, Krampus is to me very Austrian.
Hmm.
And Dickens did live in France. He spent a lot of time in France. He lived in Italy for a year, but he never went to Austria. He went to Switzerland, and I wonder if Krampus is in Switzerland as well. I've not seen any mention of it in Dickens, but it's a very interesting question. I was recently in Vienna just at the end of November, and there were the little Krampuses there, and I remember thinking,
Hmm.
well, if you were a child then, it's quite a scary thing. Austrian children, I think, must be absolutely terrified by. So the Krampus is the little devil, for those who don't know, who will kind of come on St. Nicholas's Day if you've been badly behaved. Instead of getting your chocolate St. Nicholas, get told off by the Krampus. Yeah, the chocolate Krampuses still don't look very nice.
It's a
And
very Viennese thing, though, to turn something terrifying into yet another
Yeah,
form of chocolate.
yeah, that's very true.
Marjorie also asks, was there anything from the French that influenced Victorian Christmas?
It's a very, very good question, actually. So I mentioned earlier the chocolate Yule log, and the first famous recipe was by a French chef. But the most important thing was that the Christmas cracker actually evolves from a little French sweet. So there was a London baker called Tom Smith, and it couldn't be more London sounding than Tom Smith, really. And he went over to Paris. He had his own bakery shop, and he saw these little bonbons that were sold in a type of paper that crackled, and he really liked this paper, and he decided that he would make special Christmas things in this crackly paper. And then that grew and grew, and then eventually there would be the snap, the thing that actually cracks in it, and then he would add the motto and the hat, and the Christmas cracker evolved over the decades to the cracker that we know today. I don't know I know most people in America don't have them, but I think you're probably all aware of what they are. But yes, that grew very much from the French. We
Yeah,
don't, which I think
they
is a
sell
bit,
them at shops sometime. I've seen them
yeah,
more
you do see them.
often now than ever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing that we don't normally do here, though I am starting to see it creeping in more, thanks to French bakeries, is on the 6th of January, the Three Kings Day, as they call it in Spain, is the galette du roi, the
Oh,
kind of
yes. Oh,
the king's cake, which I think we should start to definitely have currency over here because they're delicious.
yes. I don't see any more questions.
Oh, I've just been told they have crackers in DC. Thank you for that, Marjorie. I was just out in Washington, DC. Just to say, if you're in Washington, DC, and you haven't yet been to the Ford's Theatre to see their wonderful
Mm,
performance of A Christmas Carol, do go. I was just there a couple of weeks ago, and I thought it was absolutely magical. Really fantastic performance.
wonderful, wonderful. Well, if we don't have any more questions, we'll close things up. Thank you so much, Lucinda, and
Thank
thank you,
you for
Gareth,
inviting
for
me.
acting as our moderator for today.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Gareth.
Thank you, Lucinda.
Yeah.
May I wish everybody a very Merry Christmas.
Yes. Merry Christmas
Yes,
to
you too.
everyone.
And a
Uh,
very, very contented Boxing Day.
yeah.
Thank you so much. Ditto. I will think of your retriever running mad as my Labrador.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, and Merry Christmas. Please purchase Victorian Christmas. You can do so through our bookstore at the museum. It is a very beautiful book,
It
a
really
very
is.
beautiful edition. Make sure you take it easy with the Smoking Bishops. I will be
Yeah.
making that
Oh, good.
this
Excellent. Let me know
Christmas.
how
I
it
will give
goes.
it a try.
Yeah,
Yes,
let
I
us know how it
certainly
goes,
will.
if you can.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. Have a
Thank you
great
so much, everyone. Merry
day or
Christmas.
evening wherever you are.
Take
Thank
care.
you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.